Today was a monumental loss for prosecutors in the Diddy case. They were, I wish there were a bigger word than the word losers, because that's what they are. This case would never have been brought if the only issues were whether he transported a sex worker across state lines to have sex. There is no way they would have done it. I mean, you look at this case, and they had 70 Homeland Security agents at Diddy's homes in Miami and LA, and they spent a fortune putting this case together. And what did they get? A not guilty verdict on racketeering, a not guilty verdict on sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie, a not guilty verdict on sex trafficking as it relates to Jane. Those were the reasons why this case was brought. They said he was a racketeer. The jury said no. They said that he was raping Cassie and coercing Cassie and Jane and forcing them into these freak-offs. The jury didn't buy it. Now again, I wasn't in the courtroom, nor were you. I mean, you got to see the witnesses, see the evidence. And the jury not only was not buying it, but now that we look at it, remember, an hour into this case, an hour into deliberations, the jury came back to the judge and said one of the jurors, juror 25, was not following jury instructions. What really stunned me about that is that it's almost like he was the holdout and everybody else felt one way, he felt another way. And they did that within an hour. And he obviously came around, it seems. And this didn't seem a difficult decision for the jury. It seems like they were pretty much in agreement on the first straw vote. So did the prosecution prove its case? No. Yes, he was found guilty on the Mann Act, 2 counts. But again, this is an antiquated law. Let me just explain the Mann Act. That if Diddy had taken somebody from the San Fernando Valley, a sex worker, and then brought them over the hill to a hotel in Beverly Hills and paid them, well, that would be solicitation of prostitution. Guess what? It wouldn't even be a felony case. The DA wouldn't take a case like that. It'd be a misdemeanor case that the city attorney might file. Generally, they don't. But if they do, it's 6 months, maximum a year in county jail, which they never give. And yet, we are now looking at a prosecution that got 2 convictions of putting a sex worker on an airplane and flying to where Diddy was. That's what this case ended up to be. A huge, a monumental loss for prosecutors. And I gotta say that I wanna go back to the news conference the U.S. attorney had, where the U.S. attorney spent time talking about baby oil. And when I heard him talking about baby oil, I'm just thinking, what does this have to do with a federal prosecution? Yes, it's salacious, but what does it have to do with 70 Homeland Security agents? Now look, and I'm not saying Cassie wasn't abused. We know she was abused. We saw the Intercontinental Hotel video, but he wasn't being prosecuted for that. And to say, and I have talked about this from the beginning, to say this dude was a racketeer, he's a bad guy. And I think a criminal. He's committed a lot of crimes along the way. But a racketeer? And again, I will say this one more time. A racketeer is somebody in organized crime. This was disorganized crime. This was a jealous, crazy, even criminal boyfriend who is so crazed that burglarize Kid Cudi's house, or maybe blow up the car and kidnap somebody and give them a lie detector test. But there's no enterprise. It's not, Bad Boy Records. That's not what Bad Boy Records was doing. It was a crazed boyfriend who was doing this. That's not organized crime. And clearly, the jury saw that. And they came back unanimously on it. So what do we end up with? We end up with a case that, if it was all within one state, would have been maximum a misdemeanor in the city attorney's office. Just think about that. So now the question, what was really behind this? Maybe the prosecutors really believed in their case, but I question that news conference where, they decided it's not just that we're going to file a case against him, we're going to have a whole big news conference laying out all the evidence, talking about the salacious things like baby oil and Astroglide and whatnot. And then you got to wonder, was their motivation to seek justice, or was this, at least in part, a publicity grab? And I say that because I don't get, A, why they held a news conference, and B, why they're bringing in things like baby oil. I want to say one other thing, that, the jury saw the freak-off videos, and a lot of people thought, oh, that's going to hurt Diddy. I think it's the opposite, because that video doesn't get in the head of Cassie or Jane. They just see them having sex. And, between looking at the video, looking at those text messages saying, when are we going to have the next freak-off? I love these freak-offs. It's possible for sure that there were times when they didn't, but the jury wasn't buying that he coerced them. They just weren't buying it because it's complicated when they're in long relationships with Diddy. So I'm not saying they weren't abused, but the prosecution, to file a case like this, to spend this kind of money, to invest the resources they did, they got to know going in that there's a chance they can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It seems this jury had no problem finding him not guilty on the main counts. Now, as for what's going to happen to him, whether he's going to get significant prison time, I don't know. I just don't think so. Because ultimately, do you put a guy in prison because he hired a sex worker and flew him on an airplane? Do you put him in prison for 10 years? I don't think so. Do you put him in prison for 5 years? I don't think so. Now, you could say, well, we're going to put him in prison because he's just a bad guy. But that's not what the law says. The law doesn't say you can look at a guy and say, he's just a bad guy, so we're going to throw the book at him. That's wrong. That's wrong. They did that with O.J. Simpson in that kidnapping case in Las Vegas. And even though I covered the O.J. Simpson murder cases, the civil and criminal, and knew he was guilty, the kidnapping case was BS. And yet, the judge threw the book at him as a pound of flesh because he was found not guilty in the murder case. That wasn't fair. That wasn't right. And you can't look at the guy and say, I just dislike him so much that I'm going to do what I might not do if he were a different guy. You got to apply the law fairly. And I just don't see him getting significant prison time. I may be wrong, but this Mann Act is an antiquated law. It was used for racial purposes initially. And it's no different from, going after a John on Hollywood Boulevard, which is a misdemeanor case. It's transporting a sex worker. So I just don't see significant time here. Bottom line here, the prosecution may have convicted him on the Mann Act, but they lost this case in a spectacular way.